The night hope faded. The night outside Street Grace Hospital was a quiet one. The kind of quiet that felt unnatural, almost too heavy, as if even the world outside could sense the weight of the moment unfolding inside room 304. Inside, an 8-year-old boy named Ethan Parker lay motionless on the hospital bed. His frail body, wrapped in soft white sheets, looked almost too small for the large bed. His skin was pale, his breathing was weak, and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, slow and unsteady, filled the air with an eerie finality. His parents, Sarah and Michael, sat on either side of the bed, holding their son's hands, unwilling to let go. Tears streaked Sarah's face, silent sobs shaking her frame as she clung onto Ethan's small fingers. Michael, usually the strong one, sat frozen, his face blank with shock, his eyes staring into nothingness. He had no more words left, only an unbearable ache that filled every part of his being. They had prayed, they had hoped, but time was slipping away. And then there was Charlie. The golden retriever, Ethan's best friend, lay curled up beside him, his large head resting gently on the boy's chest. His ears flicked occasionally at the sounds of the machines, but he never moved away. He had been there since the beginning. Since the first night Ethan was rushed into the hospital. Since the day the doctors had given them the news they never wanted to hear. And now, even as the shadows of despair loomed over the room, Charlie refused to leave. The doctor's verdict. The door creaked open, and Dr. Richard Coleman stepped in. His expression said it all before he even spoke. Sarah's heart clenched. Michael squeezed Ethan's tiny hand, bracing himself. The doctor took a deep breath, removing his glasses and rubbing his temples before finally meeting their gaze. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice low. "There's nothing more we can do." Sarah shook her head, refusing to believe the words. No, you're wrong. There has to be something. Some test, some treatment, anything." Dr. Coleman's face softened, but his tone remained firm. "Ethan's heart is too weak. We've exhausted every option. We're out of time." The words felt like a knife slicing through the air. Michael clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the arms of the chair until his knuckles turned white. Sarah, her body trembling, collapsed onto the bed, pressing her forehead against Ethan's hand. "No, please, no." The doctor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I know this isn't fair. I wish I had a different answer. But," he exhaled sharply, "you should say your goodbyes." And with that, he left, leaving them with nothing but the slow, fading beeps of the heart monitor, the guardian that refused to leave. Charlie lifted his head. His deep brown eyes followed Dr. Coleman as he exited the room, then turned to Sarah and Michael, and finally he looked at Ethan. And something changed. His ears perked up, his breathing became steady, calculated. And then he did something that caught both parents off guard. He stood up and began pacing the room. At first, it seemed random. His nails clicked against the cold hospital floor, his movements restless. But as Sarah wiped her tears and looked up, she realized. Charlie wasn't pacing. He was waiting. Sarah frowned, glancing at Michael, who also noticed the dog's odd behavior. "Charlie," Michael called softly. The golden retriever stopped. His head snapped toward the window, his eyes fixed on something unseen. And then he let out a low whimper, a plea, a call. For what, they didn't know. Sarah followed his gaze, staring at the large hospital window, where the full moon bathed the room in silver light. The air inside seemed to shift. It was as if something unseen had entered the room, something powerful, something unexplainable. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine, and that's when the heart monitor changed. A miracle in motion. The beeping, once slow and faint, suddenly spiked. Sarah's heart stopped. Michael jumped from his seat. Ethan's small chest rose sharply, his fingers twitching. His heart was beating faster. The alarm on the monitor blared, sending nurses rushing into the room. Dr. Coleman stormed in, his face filled with confusion and urgency. "What's happening?" he demanded. One of the nurses checked the monitors, her face pale with disbelief. "Doctor, his vitals are stabilizing." Dr. Coleman frowned. "That's not possible. Let me see." As the medical team swarmed around Ethan, Charlie moved. The golden retriever leaped onto the bed, pressing his body against Ethan's frail frame. "Get that dog out of here," Dr. Coleman barked. But before anyone could touch him, Ethan's eyes fluttered open. A voice that called him back. The entire room froze. Ethan, who had been unresponsive for days, was now looking around. His expression was weak, his body still fragile, but his eyes were open. And the first thing he said, "Charlie, you didn't leave me." Sarah gasped. Michael's legs almost gave out. Tears streamed down their faces as they rushed to the bed, grabbing their son's hands. "Ethan," Sarah sobbed. "Oh my God, you're awake." Dr. Coleman, who had been frozen in place, finally found his voice. This isn't possible." He looked at the monitors again. His heart, it's beating stronger. His vitals are normalizing. The nurses exchanged stunned glances, whispering among themselves. And then they all turned to look at Charlie. The golden retriever lay beside Ethan, his head resting gently against the boy's shoulder. His eyes, though tired, held a look of quiet understanding, as if he had always known this would happen. The power of love. Sarah gently cupped Ethan's face, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "You came back to us," she whispered. Ethan smiled weakly. "Charlie told me to." Michael's breath hitched. "What do you mean, buddy?" Ethan closed his eyes, his voice barely a whisper. "When everything went dark, I heard him. I heard Charlie's voice calling me back. He never left me, even when I thought I was alone." Silence fell over the room. Dr. Coleman swallowed hard, still trying to process what he was witnessing. Sarah turned to look at Charlie again. And in that moment she knew. Whatever had happened, whether it was science, fate, or something beyond human understanding, it was Charlie's love that had saved her son. The love that defied fate. The hospital room was silent, yet filled with the weight of something unexplainable. Ethan's small, weak voice had shattered the despair that once suffocated the air. "Charlie told me to come back." Sarah and Michael were still holding their son's hands, their fingers trembling. Their child, who doctors had all but given up on, was awake. Dr. Coleman, standing near the monitors, couldn't take his eyes off the readings. He looked from the screen, to Ethan, to Charlie, as if searching for logic where there was none. The golden retriever still hadn't moved. Charlie was still pressed tightly against Ethan, his breathing heavy, his eyes tired but watchful. He had done something. But what? Michael swallowed hard and looked at his wife. She was crying. But for the first time in months, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of hope. The doctor who couldn't explain it. Dr. Coleman finally cleared his throat, shaking his head in disbelief. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, stepping closer to the bed. Ethan turned his head slightly toward the doctor, his eyelids half closed but aware. "Doctor," Sarah whispered, afraid to even ask. What's happening?" Dr. Coleman adjusted his glasses, still focused on the monitor. "I don't know," he admitted. "This is medically impossible." Sarah's breath hitched. Michael, always the skeptic, took a deep breath. "But it's happening, isn't it?" he challenged. The doctor exhaled sharply. "Yes," he said. "It is." He turned back to Ethan, his voice softer now. "Ethan, can you tell me what you're feeling? Are you in pain?" The boy blinked slowly, his fingers twitching slightly in his parents' hands. "Tired," he murmured, his voice fragile. Sarah quickly wiped away her tears and smoothed back his hair. "That's okay. Sweetheart," she whispered. "You rest, okay? We're here." Charlie shifted slightly, pressing his body even closer. Michael noticed it. Everyone noticed it. And that's when Dr. Coleman spoke again. "Charlie," he said slowly, eyeing the dog. "Something changed when he jumped onto the bed, didn't it?" Sarah hesitated. "Doctor, are you saying?" Dr. Coleman sighed. "I'm not saying anything yet," he admitted, "but I'd be a fool to ignore what just happened." His gaze lingered on the golden retriever, watching him carefully. And then he saw it. Charlie's breathing. It was slower, weaker. Something was off. And suddenly, Dr. Coleman's expression shifted from disbelief to concern. "How long has Charlie been like this?" he asked. Michael frowned. "Like what?" Dr. Coleman crouched down beside the dog, reaching out. When his fingers brushed Charlie's golden fur, he noticed something strange. His body was colder than it should be. Sarah saw the change in the doctor's face and immediately panicked. "What is it? What's wrong?" Dr. Coleman hesitated, then looked up at her with an expression that sent a chill down her spine. "I think Charlie is giving Ethan something we don't understand." Ethan's eyes welled with tears. His voice, though weak, was full of determination. "Charlie, no." The words were simple, but they cut through the room like a command. Michael exhaled sharply, his hands balling into fists. He had never believed in things he couldn't explain. He had spent his whole life believing in science, logic, reason. But this was something else. And right now, the only thing that mattered wasn't what was possible. It was what was real. The doctor, with no explanation. Dr. Coleman stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed tightly, his face a mixture of frustration and awe. I don't," he muttered, shaking his head. "This shouldn't be happening." Sarah turned toward him, her voice trembling. "But it is," she said. The doctor sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I've seen recoveries," he admitted. "I've seen cases where children have come back when we thought all hope was lost." He looked at Ethan. "But I've never seen a case where a child's vitals stabilized at the exact same time his dog started deteriorating." Michael's jaw tightened. "Are you saying?" "I'm not saying anything," Dr. Coleman interrupted, "because there's no medical explanation for this." He glanced down at Charlie, frowning. "But I can tell you this. That dog isn't sick. He isn't suffering from anything we can see." He paused, his voice lowering. "It's almost as if he's giving something away. The bond that couldn't break." Ethan let out a shaky breath and pressed his forehead against Charlie's fur. Tears slipped down his cheeks. "Charlie," he whispered, his fingers gripping harder. "You were with me the whole time." Sarah swallowed a sob. "You called me back," Ethan continued, his voice cracking. "I heard you. I felt you. You never let me go." His breath hitched. "And now I won't let you go, either." For the first time that night, Charlie's tail moved. Just a little. Barely a twitch. But enough. Michael's breath caught. "Sarah." Sarah clapped a hand over her mouth. Charlie's body, though still weak, shifted ever so slightly. His breathing, slow just moments ago, grew a little deeper, a little stronger. Sarah reached out instinctively. "Charlie." Another twitch of his tail, a faint, barely there flicker of recognition in his tired eyes. And then, a sound. A whimper. Soft, weak, but unmistakable. Ethan squeezed his best friend tighter. "Come back," he pleaded. "You told me I wasn't alone. You said it wasn't time for me to go. So now I'm saying it to you." Charlie's chest rose. And then, he licked Ethan's hand. A soft, slow movement. But it was enough. Ethan let out a breathless laugh, fresh tears streaming down his face. Michael let out a shaky exhale, his entire body going limp with relief. And Sarah did the only thing she could do. She wept. Because whatever this was, whatever force had saved Ethan, whatever love had tied them together, it wasn't breaking. Not tonight. The days that followed. No one could explain it. Not Dr. Coleman. Not the nurses. Not even Michael, who had spent his entire life demanding proof before believing in something. But what mattered was this. Ethan recovered. And so did Charlie. It took time. Ethan's body was still weak. His heart still needed monitoring. But he was here. He was alive. And each day, his strength returned, slow but steady. Charlie remained by his side through it all. He still moved slower than before, his body taking its time to heal from whatever had happened that night. But he never left Ethan's side. Not even once. And as Ethan got stronger, so did Charlie. The nurses called it a miracle. Dr. Coleman called it impossible. Michael? He stopped calling it anything at all. Because some things didn't need words. A love that would last forever. Weeks later, Ethan was finally discharged. As he left the hospital, holding onto his mother's hand, Charlie walked proudly beside him, his steps still a little slow, but filled with the same unbreakable loyalty. Ethan stopped outside the hospital doors and looked down at his best friend. "You saved me," he said softly. Charlie tilted his head. Ethan knelt down and pressed his forehead to the golden retrievers, his small hands cupping his fur. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know how much I love you." Charlie wagged his tail. Just once. But it was enough. Because this wasn't just a story about a boy and his dog. It was a story about love. The kind of love that transcends science, time, and even fate itself. The kind of love that says, "Wherever you go, I'll follow." Because sometimes miracles don't come in medicine. Sometimes they come on four paws, with a heart that beats only for you. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.